Please take your seats. I'm sure all of you had a lot to think about last night. I'd like to welcome you to the second day of the International Conference, Rural Inequalities, Evaluating Approaches to Overcome Disparities, which is organized by the Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD. So there were a number of common themes and messages that came through yesterday's discussions. We heard that inequalities are not just gaps, they're power imbalances, with this power mostly held by the wealthy 1%. And there's a danger in assuming that having policies and projects that reduce poverty but do not specifically focus on reducing inequality are sufficient to address this. Reducing inequality should be an objective in and of itself, and this is rarely the case. We heard from numerous speakers that context matters. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Many speakers also spoke about the need to build social cohesion and consensus for action. And this will be something that will be addressed more today when we talk about relationships and rights. Another thing we're going to talk more about today is the gender gap. As one speaker said yesterday, rural inequalities will remain until women can participate in drafting the laws and policies that affect them. And then, of course, there's the overarching question: whose responsibility is it to ensure rural equality, should I say? In a globalized world, who is responsible for protecting the rights of the rural poor? Oscar Garcia, the director of the Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD, made a call on us yesterday to be provocative. Let's continue to be provocative today because we need to be challenged. We need to feel uncomfortable. Inequality is not something we should feel comfortable about. Before we start the plenary session, I'd like to welcome our virtual audience who are joining us via webcast. You can also follow the event and share your impressions on social media through the hashtag #EvalInequalities. Our evaluation colleagues from IFAD will also be sharing snippets and sound bites on Twitter from the handle IFADEval. I just want to remind you, we're going to break out into groups later on, but for all the sessions in the Italian conference room, we'll be using an online interactive question platform called Mentimeter, in addition to the questions via the roving mic. I'll just remind you, for those of you who weren't here yesterday or didn't get a chance to use it, we'll see if it can come up on the screen behind us. The way it works is that your phone needs to be connected to the internet. You can find the details of how to do that on the blue card on your seats. You open your web browser and go to www.menti.com, M-E-N-T-I. And we'll use the number code, which I'm hoping is going to come up on the... Yes, there we go. You'll see the code is 68628. And once you've typed that in, you'll get the option to ask your question. So these questions are anonymous. They're going to be displayed directly on the screen so that the moderators and panelists can pick up on these questions and address them when it's appropriate. So it's now time to start off the second day with a plenary address by Professor Andrea Cornia, Professor of Development Economics at the University of Florence. I'm going to give the floor to Benjamin Davis, the leader of the Strategic Program to Reduce Rural Poverty of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. He's going to moderate the session, and I'll pass over to you.
Ms. Florence.
Hello. There we go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here this morning, moderating this session with Professor Andrea Cornia, who he's a professor of development economics at the University of Florence. Really doesn't need an introduction. I know his work has been very formative for many of us in the field, me in particular, so I don't want to waste time on introduction because it's not really necessary. Your work precedes you. Today he'll be giving a talk entitled "Can a Historically Plausible Reduction of Inequality Eradicate Rural Poverty by 2030?" And so I'll pass it over for you, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Okay, thank you. I see. Sorry, just a moment. Okay. This is the question. So I negotiated with the IFAD colleagues the title of my presentation. And the presentation is, in a way, influenced by the debate we had in the CDP, the Committee for Development Policies, which advises ECOSOC, in which there is all this emphasis on leaving no one behind. And the flavor of the month now is inequality. And old people like me, not like Benjamin, that is young, they remember that before there was integrated rural development, and there was human capital, and there was get the prices right, and then so many other recipes. Now, development economics is complicated, and you have to act on several fronts at the same time. In this moment, I think that the emphasis on inequality, which is very good, because I think it's a terrible thing, but the conclusion of this paper is that that's not enough to eradicate poverty. And I anticipate the conclusions to the question. So will an eradication, will a major decline in inequality eradicate rural poverty? Yes, in several countries. Now, these are countries with high income inequality and the GDP per capita which is not too low. So there is something to be redistributed. No, in countries with low Gini, because it will not go down any further, and with slow GDP growth, because inequality is already fairly low, and there is not much to be redistributed. And this is the case of many African countries. No, in countries with a very high population, persistent high population growth in relation to the resource base. So the picture is an articulate one. Now, and in the last two group of countries, in the little model which I developed, one needs to act as well on growth, which does not sound very popular these days, but is needed, population policies in certain countries, and food prices. Many other variables like human capital and so on and so forth are basically reflected in inequality, growth, and so on and so forth. So it's not that... Now, what is the content? One is the framework of analysis. Yesterday, the head of evaluation, Oscar Garcia, I think, said us that we have to focus on the rural sector. And my view is that one has to place the analysis in a broader context. And that if you want to reduce rural poverty, if you want to eradicate rural poverty, you have to look also at the urban sector and the international economy. And I explain why. Then, very quickly on the features of the poor, that is implicit in what we will do. And then we can say, okay, let's try to do a little bit of modeling and see what are the values of the determining variable, the right-hand side variables, which is growth, inequality, population growth, and food prices. And see, simulating under different scenarios, whether poverty will be eradicated in rural areas. And so we do a simulation exercise. Now, what is the framework of analysis? Now, one could say, I look at the rural sector, the bottom line. Well, you have to, of course. And then in the rural sector, there are some path-dependent, long-standing obstacles to poverty eradication. The main one is land distribution, property rights, availability of irrigation, and so on and so forth. But the rural sector is very much influenced by what happens in the urban sector. And the urban sector has traditionally discriminated the rural sector. I mean, more in development theory, I mean, the main model which has been used is, unfortunately, the Lewis model, which sees the rural sector as a sort of a reservoir of labor, primary commodities and other things, which are then transferred to the urban sector, and this is where growth occurs. In alternative to that, there is the Rani's-Fay model, which is much more reasonable, and in which basically you follow a pattern of investment which is more balanced. And it is in the interest of the entire economy and of the rural sector that part of the investment goes into the rural sector. It's not a passive sector, you know. Now, if you look at the, for instance, share of public expenditure on rural versus urban, the numbers are terrible. You know. And if you look at the drainage of taxes out of the rural sector into the urban sector is equally terrible. Now there are no more marketing boards, or there are few of them, but I mean, basically there is a huge drainage of resources. And so if you don't take into account what happens and how the policies in the urban sector operate, then you don't get a clear picture of what happens. So the action is, and in this case the World Bank was right, in trying to modify this type of situation. Then there is the world economy. Now the world economy, there are international terms of trade. For instance, okay, this is the net barter terms of trade for Malawi for a long while, for many years, from 1967 to 2013. So if the demand and prices of the goods you produce, they keep falling, then, I mean, the rural sector has a lot of problems in trying to keep up. And poverty eradication will be delayed. Now, who sets the prices and demand on the global markets? Not Malawi. And the model of economy which we are using is the one of a small, dependent economy. Now, Oscar was telling me that IFAD operates also in Brazil, in Mexico, and probably in Italy or something like that. You know? No, I'm just joking. And but I think that a large number of countries that are being assisted are economies that are producer of one or two commodities whose prices and demand are set in the international market, and that they are recipient of global shocks. You know. Now, then this is another example. This is the prices of urea, which is very important in Malawi because the soil exhaustion. And when the oil price, urea is derived from oil, and when the oil prices went up in 2000, I mean, I can't see the 2008, and then there was devaluation because the balance of payment deficit. So the price of urea then they were multiplied from, let's say, from 600 to 1800, 3 times. And then who gets hit by this one? Well, those are in any case discriminated in this type of market. So, and then there are international policies. It's a pity Martin is not here because this chart reflects global macro policies. And global macro policies have been telling you trade liberalization. And here we have the blue line is the tariff rate, which falls. Tariff rate is on the left scale. So tariffs, the average tariffs, they fall from 25% in 1994 to less than 10%. And then the other chart is the red one, is the value added share of manufacturing in Malawi, which declines almost end in end, at least until 2006. So one debate is that if you follow global policies, and there are many mechanisms like the IMF, WTO, and so on and so forth. Basically, you may be in a situation in which in Africa and in Latin America, you are reprimarizing. Jose Antonio Campo has produced this idea of reprimarization. Brazil, who is a powerful economy, I remember when Maluf, I think, was the Minister of Finance, was exporting tanks, airplanes, and so on and so forth. Now, I think the main export is soja beans, you know. So what happens to the distribution of income of soja beans in relation to other exports? I mean, so that is the point. So my plea is that then we come back to this one. So my plea is that if we want to eradicate rural poverty, we have to look at the long-standing structural problem of the rural sector, land distribution, and so on and so forth. But then we have to look certainly at the issues of rural-urban interaction and what happens to the global economy, because it does not affect the US or China, but it affects Malawi, it affects Ethiopia, it affects all the small economies. Now, then there are shifts in development policies, and here I want to give you 3 examples. Now, I just mentioned the difference between Ranis Fay and Lewis. There are different views on what should be the driver of an economy. Now, in the Lewis model, you know, the paper by Professor Arthur Lewis in 1956 has influenced enormously the development thinking, and the thinking was growth takes place in the urban sector, okay? And the rural sector is like a reservoir of labor, is a reservoir of primary commodities, and so on and so forth. Actually, if you do that, you have an increase in polarization between the two sectors, and then that will put pressure on migration. Now, if you put pressure on migration, then it depends, as we were saying yesterday, on the rate of capital accumulation in the urban sector. Otherwise, you move poverty from rural areas to urban areas. Now, there are three examples which I want, country examples. One is Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, one has followed this ADLI, agricultural development-led industrialization, in which the country policymaker has reduced the urban bias of public policy and reduced food dependence. There's been a rapid growth in agricultural output. How it has been done? Well, actually by investing a lot of resources in the agricultural sector. This is not common. Now, if you look at this chart, you see that changes in the poverty account ratio over the last 15 years. And then you see that if you look at the last two lines, the poverty account, the first two columns, poverty account fell from 47 to 30 in rural areas, so declined by 17% in rural areas, and by 7% in the urban areas. And in agriculture, in the rural areas, much of the decline was due to a fall due to growth, but also a little bit to inequality. And in the urban sector, actually you see that whatever decline in poverty has occurred is due to growth, but inequality rose. Now, the decline in rural inequality has occurred with a Gini of 26, 27, 28, which is extremely low. It's very, very difficult to change. Now, what policies has ADLI proposed? Well, first of all, the idea is to include the small farmers into the market. So they retained the distribution of land introduced by the military junta or the Derg, but then they included additional clauses, like introducing a sort of an ongoing land reform. There is not much land in Ethiopia, so because of a still high fertility rate, then every 4 or 5 or 6 years, the land at the local level is being redistributed among all those who are operating in this particular part of the country. Then with some variations that the land rights can be transferred, for instance in Tigray, they can be transferred and the decision is taken by the local government, and in other parts, not in the Mara region. Now, major investment in rural infrastructure. This again is something new. Improved seeds and public and private extension services. Doubling of fertilizers use, which was extremely low, was close to zero. Multi-purpose dams. Ethiopia has a very low rate of irrigation of the land. Rural roads, safety nets. The program for the safety net in rural program has been introduced. So I thought that some of you did perhaps a paper on from protection to production. So then there is, in this case, there is from to production, but there is still a window from protection, because in rural areas you have incomplete families and people, they need to be protected. Now, at the moment, it's 1-2% of GDP and is foreign financed. Now, the other thing is that Ethiopia has recognized that excessive population growth is a major problem in terms of poverty persistence. And they've introduced policies to reduce that. Now, if you look at this, so there is a major problem still in many African countries, not all of them. Now, Ethiopia is on the right side and is yellow, I think, yes. So the dark line is average for Africa. Ethiopia was until around the 1990s above that, and then with major effort, there is a major decline in total fertility rate. And the poster child is Rwanda. Rwanda had a fertility rate of more than 8, and in 15 years reduces to 4. Paul Kagame is apparently being listened to. Now, opposite to that, you have Niger, where I've been to study the 2006 famine, which has one of the highest fertility rates, and is still going up. And there is a famine every 3 years, because basically there is not enough land, and the people are moving to dry land with exposed to wind shocks, drought, and so on and so forth. So now, is the ADLI model perfect? Far from that. There are political problems. Now, the Tigray people who are running the show are 6% of the population, and now they are facing the protest by the Oromo and other people. Now, then the land rights, if everybody receives a piece of land in the village, but if I migrate to urban areas, I lose my land, and I cannot rent it, and so only in some part of the country. Then very little rural non-agricultural activities. So yesterday we were discussing of the Chinese town and village enterprises. So migration to urban areas perhaps should occur in steps. First to small cities, and in China they created 200 million jobs in this particular area. So it's not perfect, but it's a living example, quite successful, of a policy in which if you want to operate to eradicate, you should change your development priorities, which are not, in this case, the majority of the African countries following that. Now, Malawi is, in a way, the opposite. So Malawi, I have time, still 16 minutes. Okay, I think I'm doing fine. Malawi is a very different economy. Malawi is an economy, Ethiopia was colonized for 6 years by Italy, and very short colonization, so no impact. Malawi has a long story of colonization by the Brits, so it's a white settler economy. So the distribution of land of the best land is clearly in the hand of the states. The states were in the hands of the white settlers, then with the decolonization has gone into the hands of some white settlers who stayed, and of black settlers. Then small orders and rural laborers. Now, with Banda, President Banda, the main development policies was agriculture. So they built a lot of silos, and then they basically said, you are the estates, you produce coffee, tobacco in particular, cotton. And then you small orders, you produce maize, which is the staple food, Now, so this has made sense. And at the beginning, the policy favored the smallholders. But the smallholders then were, particularly after the structural adjustment program of the World Bank, basically they were not seen as able as modernizing food production. And so there was a shift in policy towards large farm. And now in 1998, there is a major change, which is the adoption of the subsidized starter pack program. And the World Bank basically shows that this actually reverted the trend in food output. Now, this was strongly focused on the small farmer at the beginning, and perhaps it should have continued to stay like that. But then it was followed by FISP, which cost 4.5% of GDP, so it's a large amount of money, which is not well targeted. So you had an increase in food production, but an increase in inequality in the country and in rural areas. Now the other thing is that both in Ethiopia and in Malawi, there is a major population problem. Now, Malawi has no population policy, and there is a massive increase in deforestation. In Ethiopia, there is the same problem, but strong attention by the government on trying to reduce population pressure. Now, so Malawi did not move in the direction of... now, the farm size on average is 0.1, 0.2 hectares per family, which does not provide subsistence to a family. There are limited rural non-agricultural activities and no alternative activities in the estate sector. It's not that the estate sector is producing shirts because they cultivate cotton, so they integrate vertically. So Malawi is a case in which the shift in development priorities has basically been not particularly good. And so I can skip this one for the reason of time. This is, you see, for instance, this is what, this is the pointer. Oh, no, sorry. Okay. You see where there is the bar. Gini falls until 2004. Then we adopted FISP, and there is a shift in the actors. So now the actors are the larger farms. And you see output increases in 1998, first with the small one, and then with the large farms being the driver. But then the Gini rises. And then if you look at the level, Ethiopia 26, 27, here we are around 40. So this is a colonial economy. And there has not been a major change in development policies in this case. Now, Bangladesh, I was telling yesterday some colleagues that when I was 29, I went to Bangladesh and parts of India because this was considered to be a lost case, So, and there was this American sociologist called Garrett Hardin who wrote about the case for not helping the poor. That I think was from California, you know. And why the planet is has finite resources. If everybody jumps on the planet, then everybody will sink. The lifeboat theory, you know. Now, Bangladesh is a very successful case of a country which is now becoming an emerging economy. How did they do that? Now, we have decomposed the growth of this in 4 periods, and then the drivers in 6. First, ODA, which does come. Oops, what happens here? Okay. ODA, you see, 25% of growth depended on ODA in 74-80, which is a very difficult period for the country. Then you see that in the subsequent period, like in the 80s, fertility reduction accounts for 36% of GDP per capita. So if the denominator falls, actually you grow per capita faster, you know. And you see that the other thing is green revolution, for the 5th line. So the 5th line is 44% of growth. So basically, Bangladesh started recovering because of population policies and food production policies. Growth, which is the before last line, is still very low, but starts stabilizing. Look at this one. So this was the GDP growth profile. And you see that it stabilizes. And then I think that in terms of welfare economics, you can prove that even the same average is has a greater value if there is lower variance in the. Now, then you go to more recent period, and you see that fertility reduction continues to be important, and the green revolution continues to be important. But then there is the ready-made garment industry, so the shirts, I don't know what it is, ready-made garments, man. So Bangladesh was very good in using the multi-fiber agreement and in capturing the quota of that other countries didn't want to use anymore. And so it has become a major exporter of ready-made garments, which becomes more and more important. Then at the end, other factors, shrimps, tourism, and these other things. So if you look at this at the bottom, you see that the standard deviation of GDP, but we saw it in the other chart, basically falls to 0 almost, and the growth rate rises. No? Now, what other policies has been, first of all, what happened to production? Because Benjamin is here, and then he says production. So I agree with him. Now, first of all, improved HIV seeds, high-yielding variety, and fertilizers. Then the spread of tube wells, you know. Now, Bangladesh is lucky. If you want to do that in Niger, it's much more difficult because you have to dig through rocks for 100 meters. And in Bangladesh, is a very soft soil. And then if you put down the tube wells, you find water at 10 meters, you know. So now, if still they did it before they hadn't done it. So they moved from 1 crop per year to 3 crops per year of rice, you know. And so rice production grew tremendously, is the blue line. And in part, this is due to increasing yields per crop, but also by the fact that we moved from 1 crop to 3 crops. And that means agriculture. Now, that meant that a country which was really on the borderline of malnutrition basically now has produced enough food to feed its people, and in some cases even exporting. There are complementary gains in total fertility rate. If you look at the fertility rate, this goes from above 6 to around 2%. Around 2 children per fertile woman in a fertile age. And what happened, who did that? Well, Bangladesh is a very special country. So the private sector is energetic and so on and so forth. The government is a mess. There are the 2 women fighting, Sheikh Hashina and the daughter of the former wife of President Ershad. And so the political system is crippled. But there is a very thriving living society like Yunus, Brak, and so on and so forth. And so the fertility reduction has been driven to a large extent by the NGOs with government support. So the government does not oppose. This is a Muslim country. 99% of people are Muslim, but the Muslim church did not oppose that, while it is quite reluctant to allow that in West Africa, northern Nigeria and Niger, for instance. Now, so we have 3 cases. So we have Ethiopia, which started recently, and moved from Louis' model to Rani's Faye, which I think makes a lot of sense, and I think which is not as widespread, unfortunately. Now, then Malawi, which has not been able to get rid of its colonial inheritance, and then we have Bangladesh, which is a major success. I mean, if you think, this is a country which was given as kaput, finished, you know. Now, so based on that, who are the customers of IFAD? I mean, well, based on that, and then what has been said there. Well, landless people, small farmers, limited their own ownership of livestock. I mean, when land becomes short, then you have to start producing with activities which consume very little land, so rearing livestock. No farming of high value-added fruits and vegetables that require water, limited access to irrigation, distance to market, and then some individual characteristics or family characteristics. Low human capital of the head of the household, age of the head of the household, a female head of the household size and dependence rate, death disease, and then the sector of employment. I mean, actually, if you are in rural areas and if you work for the public sector, if you are an administrator, for instance, then actually you have a much lower probability of being poor, you know. And finally, lack of safety nets. So yesterday, in the last session, the RIMA presentation was quite interesting because showed that if you do have safety nets, then people... Now, plausible values. Now we move in the last 5 minutes or so to say, okay, given that there is a variety of experiences, can we eradicate that? Forget this formula. But basically, we try to say, okay, what determines the likelihood that we will eradicate poverty? Well, in this model, 4 variables. And you have a paper outside that explains that. Well, one, growth, of course. I mean, normally, even if it is an unfair type of growth, I mean, there will be some small elasticity of poverty reduction. Then inequality. Then population, because the growth is GDP per capita. So when you take logs, and then basically you can separate the denominator from the denominator, so population policy. So if you are in Niger, 5% growth and 4% growth of population, then GDP growth per capita is 1%. And then we also included food prices, the ratio of food prices to consumer prices. I see here Michael, who has written a paper on that on Burkina Faso. Now, the question is that if we project these values for this variable to the year 2030, which is the year in which no one should be left behind, what value should we give to these variables? Now, for GDP growth, I'm unable to project growth for 80 countries. So I took the World Economic Outlook of the IMF, 2016, and I took the growth rate which were produced by that. And there are 78 countries that had poverty in 2013. For the other variables, we assigned the most favorable changes that we have observed during the last 30 years. It makes no sense, as it is often done in the UN, to say, oh, inequality will fall by 30 Gini points, because it doesn't exist. You know? So it's not realistic to assume enormous gains. So which are the gains? Now, population growth. Population growth, the fastest decline in population we observed during the last 20 years is China. But China had a very stringent population policy. You know? And so we say, okay, fine. So in relation to the United Nations Population Division projection to the year 2030, we assume that it will be 13% lower. Now, if you are in Angola, where the population will increase between 2015 and 2030 by 60%, a 13% decline is basically almost irrelevant. You know? Now, population depends on 2 things, the population growth. Well, it depends on TFR and the share of women in fertile age in the total population. So here, again, we have shown it before. Some countries went through demographic transition, and others did not. Now, for income inequality, this is the beautiful picture. You know, I wrote a book about inequality in Latin America, and this is a miracle. You know, Brazil, Latin America was and remains probably the most unequal region in the world, together with Southern Africa. And so you see that from 2002, the Gini index goes down from 54 to 46. And they updated to 2015. So we say, okay, which country, this is the average for the region, you know? So in the region, the country with the biggest decline is Brazil. So we say, okay, we assume that there is a 20% decline in inequality. We assume that fertility will decline as in Africa. The growth is this one. And then food prices. Now, as Michael Grimm and others and ourselves have done, now there is evidence that if the ratio of food price index to consumer price index rises above 20-25% by the end of the year, Gini will increase by about 2 points. So we did a simulation saying, okay, we assume that there will be price distortions, and of course the price distortion, they affect much more the poor, which consume 60, 70, 80% of their own income, of the total consumption of food, you know? And so in some cases we did that and others. Now the elasticities, now, it takes a little bit of time, and I only want to show two things. These are the elasticities. For instance, if I increase growth by 1%, and I cross-tabulate this data by Gini columns, so Gini 03, 04, 05, 06, and then by Z, which is the poverty line, divided by GDP per capita. So if I'm in a country with Z income per capita 0.33, it's not particularly poor. But if I go to a country which has the last line 1, it means that it's an extremely poor country. You know? So these are cross-tabulation done by Kakwani. And so the green part shows that when you get very poor, basically the elasticities are higher for growth. You know? So there is a growth issue. But if you are in countries like 0.33, you see the elasticity of inequality. If I reduce inequality by 1%, the elasticity is 5.2, and the growth inequality is 3.9. So if I'm in Brazil, I think there is a lot of scope for reducing poverty by reducing inequality. Okay, sorry, I'm being kicked out. Now, so we did all sorts of simulations. We are almost done. Now, so if we assign all the best practices in this country, so the fastest decline in Gini, fast decline in population, API, and so on and so forth. Now, what does it happen? Well, it happens that and these are various scenarios in which we introduce in a stepwise mode all the variables. And even in the best case, which is the 6th, basically you see that you have something like 16 countries out of 78 that will never be able to eradicate poverty, even increasing growth rate by an additional 1%. Otherwise, there are 24. So now these are like calculations, so the numbers, if I change the elasticity, could go up or down, etc., etc. But it's plausible. And then we've done so many simulations that I think is fairly robust. So the main conclusion is that is inequality an important driver of eradication of poverty in rural areas? Yes, it accounts as much as growth, you know. And it is very important in countries where there is something to be redistributed. In Burkina Faso, there is not much to be redistributed. In Niger, there is not much to be redistributed. You know, perhaps oil rent now in Niger. They discovered oil. You know, so and then which are the countries which are affected? So the blue line, these are Africa. So basically, you see that unless you are able to increase the rate of growth in Africa, there will not be poverty reduction. I'm not a growth maniac. Growth accompanied by inequality reduction and sustainable. And that is what it is being done. Now, so I think that we want to conclude by saying that, first of all, focusing only on the rural sector, I think may be reductive. I mean, because there are very strong influences, particularly for small, dependent, and subsistence economies. And these are economies which are those that are not graduating, basically. You know? Second, that inequality explains a lot of poverty eradication, but particularly in poor countries, there is a growth issue. Now, do we have an agreement on what are the prescriptions for growth? No, there are very different prescriptions. And if I listen to my dear friend Jose Antonio Campo, Africa and Latin America are being reprimarized. So the International Division of Labor, which is emerging during the last 10, 15 years, is one which is neo-colonial. So you produce primary commodities and they produce manufactured. And then what is the effect on inequality? Negative. You know, so I think I should stop here. On time?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor. And sorry to pressure you so much, Andrea. Sorry to pressure you so much on time, but it was important.
I had a nervous breakdown. I thought you would punch me.
Just so we could have time for discussion, because yesterday I felt there was some frustration we couldn't have discussion. No? So now we open it up for questions, comments. I see a hand in the back.
Perhaps I borrow your pen.
Please, yeah. Can't really hear you.
That's better. Okay, my name is Florence. I found that was a fascinating presentation like yesterday. Where I come from, I've been working on food security, nutrition, and livelihoods all my career. And I have been recently working much more on sustainable food systems, in particular at territorial level. And I'm trying to see how to reconcile what I'm hearing with where we're at. Because many of us now think, I love the terms of reprimatization. We are talking also of relocalization of agriculture. That is, it's not either a national policy which is export-driven or a subsistence economy. We need to combine different modalities. We still have local food systems. These local food systems present some potential in terms of sustainability, and if we want to provide jobs and reduce poverty and inequality, probably local food systems can help do that, in particular in the post-harvest activities, getting the youth involved in transformation, etc. So I think if we could start thinking, I don't know if it's a dual system, but at least recognizing that some of those areas where we have most poverty, we do need to have more sustainable development approaches. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to improve resilience there. It's going to build on people's culture, on biodiversity, and actually help provide some of the answers. So what I'm saying, can we have a combination of approaches if we want to deal with that? Because small-scale farmers, I was in a meeting in Budapest recently.
Can you keep your comment short so we can get enough people? Because we're going to run out of time.
They're not best placed to get in the export market. Thank you very much.
Okay. We have a second comment here, and then Ivan.
I'll take Oscar's call to be provocative to heart, and there's something which has been at the back of my mind. And when I saw your presentation about the process of reprimarization and all, so let me start by probably just putting it out there that I think in some ways fundamentally the discussion around inequality and the conference itself, I believe, has been that inequality is it's not normal, at least the increasing inequality, and equality is the norm. But let's say for a moment, I just throw out the hypothesis that perhaps inequality, given the way the society is structured, the barter system, the ownership, how money follows money, the structural transformation process of countries from agriculture to manufacturing to services, how they work, and the way productivity increases, and it increase the income of some people, so to speak. Perhaps all this makes inequality actually normal in societies. If that is the hypothesis we accept, if that is the case, then are we afraid of inequalities by themselves, or are we afraid of the consequences that follow? Each and every time there's been a civil disturbance, Russian Revolution, French Revolution, so many of the other disturbances which follow. So this is something which I just wanted to put out there, and if that is indeed the case, because of the structural transformation process is going back to agriculture, the right way to increase incomes in the first place. So.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more, Ivan.
Thank you. Now? Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I would like to ask you to add another aspect in your analysis, if possible, because you moved between poverty, inequality, economic growth, and population growth. What about resilience? And what about resilience not only in environmental terms, which is what we usually put into the analysis, but what about resilience into the economic dynamic at micro level for family farmers? What would you think? Can you share your thoughts with us? What's the intention of the question in reality? There is, and in IFAD is an important debate, not formal, not systematic, but emerges every time, between two different ways of seeing things in terms of reducing rural poverty at family level, or to contribute to the specialization in certain crops which show to have potential for insertion in markets and etc., or to ensure that mainly for the poorest families we contribute, we help them to be more resilient to the increasing impact of external shocks in terms of markets mainly. And as much with families and with economies more specialized, we know that they are more fragile to the shocks, to the market shocks. So I would like to ask you if you could please share your thoughts on these things.
And if the answer is not satisfactory, I will buy you coffee.
So please.
Okay. Now, let me first answer to the question with which I disagree the most by the young gentleman here. But first of all, I mean, when you read a newspaper, Italian newspaper, American newspaper, I mean, particularly after Piketty's book. Now, Piketty wrote about the West, not about the world. Now, look at this picture for Latin America. ¿Adonde son los latinos? I mean, this has been a miracle. Nobody expected that Brazil, Argentina, and all these countries would be able to reduce inequality by so much. And we, in WIDER, we produced a very detailed analysis of that. And this has continued even after the political changes. I mean, in the 2000, there's been the left turn. 15 out of 18 countries were center-left, more radical, less radical, like Venezuelan. But the majority was a model of European social democracy, tax and spend, minimum wages, regulation, and so on and so forth. But to have a decline in income inequality in the region, which was considered to be, the Spanish people, the latifundia, and then so past dependence, it will never change. This has been like a very welcome miracle. So inequality is not something which is unavoidable. It depends on policies. And when you move in Africa from one sector to another, this is a question which I discussed with the French gentleman yesterday. So macro policies, they have a large effect. For instance, if you do trade liberalization, the people who are exiting in Malawi, but this is the same for the average of the African countries. If you move out of agriculture, where do you go? Go to manufacturing? No, because the Indians and the Chinese and the Vietnamese which are taking the market, And for many years, for 20, 30 years. So where do you go? Services. Now, what is the income distribution in the services sector? Bad. What is the income distribution in the manufacturing sector? In the manufacturing sector, which operates in Malawi? Low, because it's labor intensive and little capital intensive. So you move from a low inequality agriculture, in Malawi not so low, but in general in Africa, low. If you're in Niger, it's a shared poverty, so everybody has half an hectare, to manufacturing where inequality is not very high. So the structural transformation should go in this direction. Now, if WTO tells you that everybody should liberalize the foreign trade, then actually people, they will not find jobs in industry, in manufacturing, and will move to services. Those with a good level of education will be working in FIRE, Lance Taylor, finance, insurance, and real estate, so high wages, so human capital works in this case. And the others will work in the informal sector, where you have neoclassical, or even worse, exploitative labor market relation. So inequality is not normal. So inequality depends on policies. And if you look at the African data, which I didn't, because Oscar told me, if you put another slide, I think I will not invite you to the conference. So if you look at the African countries, there are some welcome news as well, because you have 17 countries which are mainly agriculture and a little bit of manufacturing, where inequality falls, not by much, but 2 or 3 points. And then you have the economies like Equatorial Guinea, Zambia, and so on and so forth, where growth is driven by mining, oil, and then where inequality, zoom, it goes up like that. So the pattern, you are quite right in pointing to the natural structural transformation of output. So for Malawi and Ethiopia, we did micro decompositions, and we see that Malawi, the move has been all in the wrong direction. So why? Well, it may be endogenous, but it's policy-driven in part, certainly. So the question is that we should identify policies that, if we care about poverty, they should be sure to reduce inequality, or at least not to increase it, because Malawi has a Gini of 45, so it's very high. So if on top of that you introduce policy which increases it, then no eradication of poverty. Now, but you are quite right. Structural transformation. In Africa, the driver of inequality is the nature of the structural transformation which has occurred. So which structural transformation do we want? We want to have a structural transformation where we see some green revolution. Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, land distribution is very egalitarian because there is very little land, so very small farm. And then we want to see an increase in output per hectare by many, many, many million farmers. That will not alter inequality, and that has basically happened because the fast growth in Bangladesh has gone with the Gini, which has increased by 2 points, error and omissions, So, but I wouldn't take it as because otherwise we become accustomed to say now inequality is rising. Now, where is it rising? The financial sector. The managers. We know where the large increase in inequality is occurring in China, in India, and in Italy, in the West, and so on and so forth. But then we had the example of half of Africa, Latin America, 4 economies in Southeast Asia, where Gini has fallen, and so which means let's regulate the financial sector, for instance. But then they even eroded the last. Law which was introduced after the Lehman Brothers crisis, Now, on relocalization, reprimarization, and I think that there is an issue. In Malawi, we may have livelihoods and the local food system, and we don't want to throw them away with the dirty water. But land, 3% growth of the population. Basically, farm size is 0.1, 0.2. And then you run against a sort of a wall. And then so something else has to be invented. And what has to be invented? Rural, non-agricultural activities. For instance, cattle rearing, which doesn't consume much land because it's done in the stable. And there is a nice paper by, I forgot the name of the author, that in Africa, on average, in rural areas, you have something like 35% of the people in rural areas working on non-agricultural activities. In Ethiopia, Malawi is 10-15%. So, and again, we go back to the debate of yesterday, perhaps rural industrialization. And there are many, many sectors where industrialization with no economies of scale, heavy products, for instance, like bricks, cement, and so on. Cement requires big factories. But metal carpentry, and so it is economically efficient to produce in small units. It's not like sectors where you have huge economies of scale, and then it has to be in urban areas. So the local food system is important, and we don't want to throw them away. But then what do we do if the country basically runs? Basically, there is no more land to cultivate. You have to invent something else. Now, resilience. Now, the resilience. The main experience on resilience I have is that I want to study a famine in Niger, which is an extreme case. Niger is a huge country, but 90% of the land is dry. It's dry land. And so the Sahel is a strip of land where it rains, if it rains, once a year. And then, so if you're lucky, you have one crop. But, there is wind erosion, soil erosion, all sorts of things. And Niger had famines once every 10 years in the past, now every 3 years, okay? Now, Why? Because there is a huge population pressure. So the good land has already been all farmed. So people, they move towards the desert. But in this case, what can improve resilience? Well, some of the individual characteristics, but mainly, I would say, food reserves. If you look at the World Bank, in this case, they were wrong. They preached the idea to say, let the market, why should you hold stocks of, I mean, it's costly to hold the stocks, no? And so the stocks, they fell from 200,000 tons of millet to something like 8,000, you know. And then they say, well, okay, that if you have a famine, the market will operate. But forgetting the fact that actually millet is not traded internationally, and that Niger is landlocked, and that the distance from the closest harbor is 1,200 kilometers. So basically now the thinking is that one should have Sahelian food reserves, and so there is a Sahelian millet market, and there should be more reserves, regional reserve system. And then all the things which were discussed yesterday, so there is self-insurance, people should, but I mean, Niger is very poor, so what was saying Pablo Arnal, I don't know if he's here. Sorry? No, okay. So he's not here, but I hope you can hear me. So if you have savings, if you have cattle, if you have land, fine. So it's a standard mechanism of self-insurance. Then formal insurance, okay, formal insurance. But formal insurance in Niger is tough because there are covariant shocks. So you should insure all the Sahel. And then actually the data show that when you have a problem, when you have a drought, often it's a drought which affects 2 or 3 countries at the same time. So the insurance company goes bust, you know. So, or should be reinsured, you know. So insurance in this particular case, where the weather pattern are as they are, they tend to be in a way problematic. Now there should be doing other things. I think the Niger is an economy like many African economies, with too few people working in rural, non-agricultural activities. That I think is. So these are activities which are not affected by weather shocks, which are the main one, you know. Now, and then particularly now with this idea of technology which are highly divisible, you know, computers, solar panels. So it's not that you need $20 million to have a plant. So there is this debate, you know. So you have technologies which are highly divisible. So a village can have a telephone, or can have a cell phone, can have a solar panel, can have other things for processing things. So that would possibly improve resilience. But if you cannot keep in Niger 90% of the population in this type of agriculture, where the good farmable land has been used already for 20, 30 years, and the population pressure is enormous. And there are not even many people migrating from Niger. They migrate from Nigeria, you know. So, and the people who migrate from Nigeria is a far richer country, you know, and they migrate for different reasons. So the Nigerians, they will have a greater reason to migrate because this is a country deprived of resources. Now they've discovered oil. They've discovered some oil. And so it depends on how the government will use the oil rent. But they could use the oil rent to start some simple manufacturing or some other things in rural areas.
We have one. Can I have 1 minute? We have 1 minute. Let me just take one question that was submitted here. If you can answer this in 1 minute.
Which one is it?
Okay, I think this one here in terms of, you were mentioning in Latin America they've actually had success in reducing inequality, right?
Uh-huh.
But in sub-Saharan, there's a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have among the worst Gini coefficients in the world, right? You know, South Africa, Lesotho, Namibia, Botswana, etc. What lessons can they learn from, given the structure of their economies, what lessons can they learn?
Well, I think that they should go to Oscar and ask what the Bolivian did. Now, well, Bolivia is an economy which is relying on a precious primary resource, which is gas. And so basically there has been a major reutilization of the gas rent for producing batteries, lithium batteries, because there is Salar de Uyuni and this and that and the other. And I think that there are possibilities of recycling rents. Now, the problem in Africa, there is my dear friend is a very good economist from Burundi, Leonce Njikumana, that basically shows that in Africa there is this problem that a large part of the rents are being exported. I mean, it actually is a form of capital flights. And he estimates that the total private, illegal, capital flights are equal to about 280 billion. And how do I measure that? Through the equilibrium condition, the balance of payment, or in France through data that the French ministry gives us. You know? So now 280 billion dollars is the total public debt of Africa. You know? So the question is, what do you do with rents? What do you think that the people in Equatorial Guinea do with this oil rent? So that the policy lessons is that at least in Peru, at least in Chile, at least in Bolivia, there has been collective utilization of some of this public rents, which actually is something which belongs to the state because it's under the ground. But in Latin America, there is more than that because there is the labor market policies. So I think there is a very good lesson. The question is it sustainable? Is Macri going to throw everything down the sink? Is Brazil, what is Brazil doing? I mean, nobody knows because if that free election, Lula would win. You know? So, and then in Latin America, the right turn, which we observe in some countries now, is not general. You know, it's about half of the countries. So, and we have the data up to 2015, and the data up to 2015 shows the inequality keeps falling. And actually, I found it difficult to explain it myself.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Andrea, for that wonderful presentation and discussion. And let's give a round of applause.
Thank you, Professor Cornia. That was a really great way to start the morning with such a stimulating discussion. Just a few things before you leave the room, just tell you what's coming up. It's now time for the first breakout session, which is going to be on the theme of relationships. How can relationships be rebalanced so that those left behind count, are recognized and have voice? Please consult your programs to see what's happening in which room. At 12:30, there's going to be a light stand-up lunch outside the executive dining room in the same place as yesterday. Following lunch, I just want to let you know there was a mistake in the program, so please note that this breakout session on rights will go from 1:30 to 2:45. So there won't be a separate coffee break, but coffee will be available outside for whenever you need it. So I'll see you back here at 2:45 for a plenary panel on going beyond rights to reduce inequalities. So find your room and enjoy your session.